The lawyer's letter arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded twice because I'd moved without updating my address, and by the time it found me, it was already 3 weeks old. It said my great-uncle Casimir, a man I had met exactly once at a funeral I barely remembered, had died in March and left me the entirety of his estate, which consisted of one asset. A 6-unit apartment building on the near northwest side of Chicago, built in 1911, fully occupied, free and clear of any mortgage. The letter said the building generated enough rental income to cover its own taxes and upkeep with room to spare, and that all I needed to do was sign a set of transfer documents and show up in person to receive the keys and the building's records from the outgoing property manager, a woman named Ilse Radovic, who had apparently managed the building for my uncle for over 30 years. I flew out the following week. Ilse met me on the sidewalk outside the building, a narrow 4-story brick structure wedged between two newer developments, its facade darker than either neighbor, its windows slightly too small for the size of the building around them. She was somewhere past 70, sharp-eyed, dressed like she'd come from a different decade entirely, and she looked at me for a long moment before she said anything at all. She said I looked like him. I didn't ask which him she meant, my uncle or someone further back, because something about the way she said it made me not want to know. She walked me through the building room by room, unit by unit, introducing me briefly to 2 of the 6 tenants who happened to be home, an older man on the 2nd floor named Petroskas who barely looked up from his newspaper, and a young woman on the 3rd floor who introduced herself only as Nadia and who watched me with an expression I couldn't place, something between curiosity and pity. The other 4 units, Ilse said, were occupied by tenants who kept to themselves and preferred not to be disturbed, and she strongly suggested I respect that preference for as long as I own the building. At the end of the walkthrough, she brought me into the basement, to a small office with a roll-top desk and a green metal filing cabinet, and set down a leather-bound ledger on the desk between us. She said this was the building's real record book, separate from the tax documents and lease agreements the lawyer had already given me, and that it had been kept, updated, and passed down by every owner of the building since it was constructed, 114 years ago. She said the first several pages were the only part that mattered on day one, and that I needed to read them before she left the city that evening, because she would not be answering questions about them by phone afterward. I read them standing at that desk, and I remember them exactly, because I have read them roughly 100 times since. Rule 1. The basement door must be locked by 9 each night and may not be unlocked again until 6 the following morning, regardless of any sound coming from below, regardless of any tenant who claims to have left something down there. Rule 2. Once each week, walk the full length of the basement corridor and count the ceiling pipes exposed along the north wall. The number has been 41 since the building was constructed. If the count is ever different, do not touch the pipes and record the new number in the ledger without correction. Rule 3. Unit 2 North, the vacant unit on the 2nd floor, must never be rented, shown, or entered by the owner except on the first day of each month, for no longer than 5 minutes to confirm the door remains locked from the inside. Rule 4. If a tenant reports hearing their own voice coming from another unit, do not investigate the other unit. Simply write down the tenant's name and the date and change nothing about their lease. Rule 5. The building's exterior lights must never all be off at the same time. At least one must remain lit at all hours on any floor on any side of the building. Rule 6. If a new tenant application lists no prior address, no employer, and no emergency contact, approve it anyway and do not ask them to correct the omissions. Rule 7. If you are ever asked to sell the building, refuse, regardless of the amount offered, and inform the buyer that the building is not and has never been for sale. Ilse watched me finish reading and asked if I understood. I told her honestly that I did not, that none of it made sense, and she said that was fine, that none of the previous 6 owners had understood it either on their first reading, and that understanding wasn't a requirement of ownership, only compliance was. She left for the airport an hour later. I stood alone in the basement office for a long time before I finally locked the door behind me at 9 exactly, the way Rule 1 required, even though nothing had made a sound yet to make me nervous about it. The first 10 days were unremarkable. I moved into the small owner's unit on the ground floor, the one Casimir had apparently kept for himself, met the remaining tenants gradually as they came and went, walked the corridor every Sunday and counted 41 pipes each time, exactly as the ledger described. I began to relax into the rhythm of it, the way you do with any strange new routine once it stops feeling strange. On the 11th night, I heard something moving in the basement after 9, a slow dragging sound, like furniture being pulled across concrete. I stood at the top of the basement stairs with my hand on the deadbolt and did not open it. The dragging continued for close to 20 minutes and then stopped. In the morning I unlocked the door at 6, went down, and found nothing out of place except a thin layer of dust disturbed in a long, curving path across the floor, as if something had indeed been dragged, though there was nothing left in the basement it could have come from. The Sunday after that, I counted the pipes twice because the first count came out wrong, 42. I counted a third time, slower, tracing each one with my finger the way Ilsa had shown me, and got 42 again. I wrote the number down in the ledger exactly as instructed, without touching anything, and left the basement feeling colder than the temperature down there could account for. Nadia knocked on my door 2 nights later, visibly shaken, and told me she'd heard her own voice coming from the vacant second-floor unit, clear as anything, saying her name over and over in a flat, patient tone. I remembered Rule 4. I wrote her name and the date in the ledger, told her I'd look into it, and changed nothing about her lease, though the part about looking into it was a lie I told mostly to make her feel less alone in the hallway at that hour. I went to the door of Unit 2 North that same night anyway, against the ledger's explicit instruction, because I told myself checking wasn't the same as entering, and because Nadia's face had unsettled me more than any pipe count. The door was locked, as it always was. But there was warmth coming through the gap beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the kind of warmth that comes from a room that has recently had people in it, or a room where the heat has simply never been shut off in over a century. I did not open the door. I told myself that was compliance with the spirit of the rule, even if I'd technically already stood there longer than the rule allowed for the monthly check. Nothing happened that night as a result, though the pipe count the following Sunday came out at 43, one higher again, and I recorded it the same way, without correction, the way the ledger demanded. Between the pipe count incident and Nadia's visit, there was a night I haven't written down anywhere until now. I woke somewhere past 2 in the morning to the sound of the ledger itself, sitting closed on my nightstand where I'd left it after that Sunday's count, making a soft, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, almost like pages settling under their own weight, though nothing in the room was moving air. I lay there a long time without touching it, telling myself it was the radiator, telling myself it was the building settling the way old buildings do in the cold. When I finally worked up the nerve to switch on the lamp, the ledger was open to a page I hadn't written on, hadn't even known existed, filled top to bottom in handwriting that wasn't mine and wasn't Ilsa's either, a list of names I didn't recognize with dates going back decades, each one followed by a single word. Some said moved, some said released. 2 of them near the bottom said neither, with nothing written after that at all. I closed the ledger without reading further, and when I opened it again the following morning to record the week's business as usual, that page was gone, replaced by the blank sheet that should have been there in the first place, as if the building had only wanted me to see it once and had no interest in me finding it a second time. I asked Nadia carefully, without mentioning the ledger, whether she'd ever noticed anything strange about the building's history, about tenants who'd lived there before her. She said only that the mailboxes in the lobby still had 2 names on them from before she moved in, names that had never been removed even though the units themselves had long since been reassigned, and that she'd once asked the building's previous manager about it and been told, in the same flat tone I now recognized as Ilsa's, that some names simply belonged to the building whether or not anyone currently answered to them. She said it in a way that made it clear she'd decided a long time ago not to think about it further, and I understood, standing in that hallway, that this was likely the same arrangement every tenant eventually reached with the building on their own, in their own time, without anyone ever explaining the terms out loud. Petroskas moved out at the end of that month, quietly, without notice, leaving behind a note that only said he was too old for this building anymore and that I should not try to find him. His unit sat empty for 6 days before a new applicant appeared, a man who filled out the form with no listed prior address, no employer, and no emergency contact, exactly the pattern Rule 6 described. I approved him without asking a single question, the way the ledger told me to, and moved his signed lease into the filing cabinet beside 11 others going back decades that matched the identical pattern, each one a different name, each one otherwise blank. The exterior lights failed once during a storm in late October, all 6 at once, for what the building's old wiring diagram suggested should have been about 4 minutes while the backup circuit reset itself. I stood in the dark hallway watching the seconds pass on my phone, remembering Rule 5, unable to do anything about it since the failure was mechanical and outside my control. In those 4 minutes I heard, distinctly, footsteps moving through the corridor above me, unhurried, deliberate, on a floor I already knew for certain was empty at that hour. When the lights came back on, the footsteps stopped exactly at the same moment, as if whatever had been walking had been waiting for the dark specifically, and had no further use for the hallway once the dark was gone. I called Ilse after that night, the first time I had used the number she'd given me. She answered on the second ring, as though she'd been expecting the call for weeks rather than surprised by it. I asked her directly what the building actually was, why the rules existed, what the count in the basement meant, and what was living behind the door of Unit 2 North that had been warm for over a century without anyone ever opening it. She was quiet long enough that I thought the call had dropped, and then she said one thing before changing the subject entirely to whether I'd remembered to renew the boiler service contract. She said the building doesn't hold anything in. It holds something down, and the rules are the only weight keeping it there. That was the whole answer she was willing to give, and something in the flatness of her voice told me that asking a second time would only tell her something about me she'd rather not know, the same way it had with every owner before me, going back to whoever had first written those 7 rules into the ledger over a century ago. The new tenant who took Petrusca's unit introduced himself to me only once, briefly, in the lobby, and never again after that, though I would occasionally hear him through the wall of the owner's unit at odd hours, moving furniture that, as far as I could tell from the lease inventory, he did not actually own. I did not investigate. Rule 6 had already told me what I needed to know about tenants who arrived with no history attached to them, and I had learned by then that the ledger's instructions were rarely explained, but were never wrong about what would happen if I ignored them. Twice more that winter, new applications came in with the same blank pattern, no address, no employer, no emergency contact, and twice more I approved them without a single question, filing the signed leases beside the others in the cabinet, watching the stack of matching blank forms grow thicker with each passing month, going back further than I had first realized, back past Casimir's ownership. Indeed, into names I didn't recognize at all, in ink faded enough to suggest decades I couldn't account for. I have owned the building for 4 months now. The pipe count sits at 45 and has not gone down since the night of the storm. 2 more tenants have moved in with no listed history at all, and I no longer hesitate before approving their applications. I lock the basement door at 9 every single night without exception, and I have learned to fall asleep to the sound of things moving beneath the floor, the way you eventually learn to sleep through traffic or a passing train. Last week, a man in an expensive coat came to the front door and offered to buy the building outright in cash for nearly triple what the tax assessor said it was worth. I told him, exactly as Rule 7 required, that the building was not for sale and never had been. He didn't argue. He simply nodded the way you nod at information you already expected to hear, and walked back to his car without another word, and I understood, watching him go, that he had likely made the same offer to Ilse once, and to whoever had owned the building before her, and that the answer had always been the same answer, given for the same unspoken reason. The ledger has a final section I only found a few weeks ago, tucked behind the tax records, that asks each owner to write their own account of their time with the building, in their own words, before passing it to whoever inherits it next. I am writing mine now at the same roll-top desk where I first read the 7 rules, with the basement door locked above the stairs and one light still burning somewhere on every floor, exactly as it should be. I have written down all 7 rules again here, in full, the pipe count and how it has changed, the warmth beneath Unit 2 North's door, the footsteps in the 4 minutes of darkness, and the offer from the man in the expensive coat, so that whoever reads this ledger after me understands precisely what they are agreeing to the moment they sign the transfer papers and take the keys from whoever and DS them over. I did not write down what Ilse told me about the weight and what it's holding down, because I still don't know how to phrase it in a way that wouldn't make the next owner close this ledger and walk straight back out to the sidewalk before the sun goes down on their very first day. I only know that somebody has to keep the lights on and the basement door locked, and that for now, in this building on the near northwest side of Chicago, built in 1911 and never once for sale, that somebody is me. I set the ledger back down gently on the roll-top desk when I finish writing this last page, closed but never locked, exactly the way it has always been left behind for whoever inherits it next, and then I go back upstairs to check that every light in the building is still burning before 9 o'clock arrives, and the basement door gets locked once more for one more ordinary night.